So this is a moment of celebration for us because it's our Burns lecture, which sometimes twice a year, sometimes once a year, brings the very best of Irish studies to Boston College. And it's a great cooperation with the Burns Library, the Burns librarian, Christian, in Irish studies. And it's a great event for all of BC because BC is all about students. And this is about, first and foremost, bringing a scholar to do their own research, but also to work with students and to showcase their studies. And it's a special event for us because this is the first time we've had a folklorist here. So it's really special for us to have a folklorist. The disciplines of Irish studies as they emerged at BC were traditionally history and literature. And it's good that we've moved beyond the written literature also to the oral word and to oral cultures. And that's interesting. A few words about Ray, and then maybe a bit more about the topic. I'd like to say a few words, if I may, even though I know we're going to hear a lot about the topic. but a few words. So Ray is from Indiana University, Bloomington, which is the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology, which at least in my opinion, is the leading department of folklore in North America today. And he's a provost professor, which is the highest degree you can reach at that university. We really have America's top folklorist of Ireland and beyond Ireland, folklorist and anthropologist, both. I first encountered Ray's work as a student in the year 2000. I remember it very clearly because there was an article about heroic outlaws in Irish folklore and in Irish literature. I said, God, that's a man I've got to keep an eye out of. This is really interesting. The whole topic was fascinating for me. And I think that was out of your MA, wasn't it? I assume. It was the MA, yeah. And then a few years later, there was another article which hit me really strongly, which was about critical nostalgia and material culture in Northern Ireland. I remember when that came out, and I said, this is really interesting work, both theoretically and the way it works with things, so you've got to really keep an eye out for this man. And then just a short while after that, I think it was 2008, the book came out on storytelling on the Irish border, on the Northern Ireland borderland. And that really was a remarkable piece of work which continues in the tradition of the great Henry Glassy and shows an ethnography on this kind of area of Ulster as it leans into kind of the borderland with the Republic of today. The book won awards on right and left, specifically the Donald Murphy Prize of ACIS for the best first book, which is a highly coveted prize. Everybody wants to win that prize, but not less importantly, it won the Chicago Folklore Prize, which is, for those who don't know, that's the holy grail of folklorists. Yeah. Everybody aspires. We all live in the gutter, we look up at the stars. Ray actually got that with his first book, which is incredible. A decade later, we were treated to his next book, Packy Jim, which he returned to the same area again and focused on one storyteller and his oeuvre and his storytelling and following the life there. I believe in both cases you went to the family at different stages in life. Am I correct that you stayed with the family in situ and observed? So Lorraine was there as well. And it's quite dramatic how you got to know for a year this kind of thing which we often Irish folklorists don't get that privilege. Often they come and they quickly come and collect folklore and leave, and you actually got to spend time and learn about his life. And once again, this won the major prize. That was the prize. It was the ACIS Prize for the best book in Irish literature, I think. You won for that one. Ray always wins the prize. That was the Durkin Prize, right? So Ray always wins the big prizes with his books, and he's written many, many articles. And no, we all are jealous of Ray on that because he really writes the incredible books. They're beautifully written. The last piece I read of yours was not that long ago. I think it was last year, an article in New Hibernian Review on willow coffins. And for those who recall, that comes out of a lecture that we had here. So you can now read it in print. It's in the New Hibernia Review. Ray has moved to deal with other scholars, with other topics, and he's taking a very brave move here. Before that, I should just reiterate. I think it's appropriate to reiterate something that Christian already said, but the fact that we do have an interest in folklore at BC, we have a commitment to folklore in BC, and as testimony of that, please do come next week to hear Natasha's talk. And Natasha Sumner is here from Harvard and the Celtic program, and it's the connection between folklore and mythology. Heroes of the Gale, a new book that just came out with Princeton University Press. It's a landmark book. Please come here for the symposium. I know that Kira is here, Kira Nerian from Harvard is here, and others will come, and we're going to have a remarkable symposium. Please do come back for that. So we'll meet again to discuss folklore. Ray today is taking us on a new path. He celebrated the life of different people, and now he's going to deal with death. And I kind of remember as a child hearing a diminutive character tell me, Never mess with a Sicilian when death is on the line. Yeah, tribute to Rob Reiner. And it makes you think, is there something particular about death? Are there certain cultures of death which have a monopoly over death? So Sicily would be a classic example, right? Somebody is sleeping with the fishes. We have messages and we have codes, right? Luca Brasi sleeps with the fishes is a Sicilian message about death. And are there certain cultures which own death? Can there even be such a thing? Now, the question might seem absurd, but I remember, this brings me way back. This is kind of partly biographical for me, Ray, but I remember very clearly when I came to Ireland to study, I was invited by Declan Khyber, the great critic, professor of Anglo-Irish literature at the time at UCD, and he invited me to a seminar with a Polish sociologist, Nina Witosek, and with an Irish writer, Pat Sheeran. They were sociologists mainly, but also looking at literature, and they just published a book, Talking to the Dead. And it was about Irish funerary traditions. And I remember sitting and listening, and when you listened to their talk and when you read their book, it was about the fact that Ireland has a unique death culture. Only in Ireland. Ireland is obsessed with death. It has a fixation with death. And I remember as a problematic student raising my hand and asking, so what's special about this? Everybody has a fixation with death. And I think death raises this question, when we look at cultures of death, the bridge between particularism, particularity, and universalism. Where do we draw the lines between that? And I can say, speaking from my own discipline, I'm an historian. Historians were uniquely qualified. We're experts in death. We're doctors of death. All our patients are dead. We deal with people who are dead, and we kind of, even though I think Paloma argued with me that the other day, that not all of them are dead. They'll get there. They're working on it. They're working on it. But I went and looked in preparation for this kind of thinking of this talk, and I went and looked at my own library. I have, I kid you not, it's a round number, 99 books with death in the title in my collection, 37 books with dead in the title. Now, not all of them are directly about what we think about death. Some use death as in an allegorical sense. I mean, a classic, George Dangerfield, The Strange Death of Liberal England. That's not exactly about a specific death, though it's a title which should be re-examined in America today, The Strange Death of Liberal. Yeah, I can imagine where we can take that one. But historians have written a lot about death. And think of people like Philippe Ariès, who's written a study of death throughout time, from medieval times till now. I'm thinking about Thomas Lecoeur, the great Thomas Lecoeur, who wrote about the world of the dead, the work of the dead. And historians have written, there's many books looking at history in the looking at death in the Middle Ages, in medieval times, in Victorian times. Each time we see obsessions and cultures of death at different times. I even discovered something that I'd forgotten, that I'd written an article on death in a collection on death and dying in Ireland, Britain, and Europe, which was published by Irish Academic Press some 10 years ago. So everybody somehow gets to that topic in some way or other. And it's not just historians. Death, of course, is the most interdisciplinary of subjects. And you know that because there's already handbooks, interdisciplinary handbooks on death. Sage had a handbook which came out in 2023, 2 volumes I have, a handbook of death. Seriously, of death and dying. Great morbid topic. Or, and this is a hint for grad students here in general, Routledge has, and I've written down the title here, the Routledge Handbook of Museums, Heritage, and Death. You know that if Routledge publishes a handbook, it's time to leave that field. That's a warning. Yeah. Saying somebody who wrote for the Routledge Handbook of Irish Studies. So yeah, we know that's the moment that the field is being done to death. We also know that folklorists have a unique perspective on death, not only because death is a prominent feature in folklore, but because also folklore deals, as was mentioned before, also with the undead. And I've been thinking a lot about that. When I looked at my collection, some of the books deal not just with the dead, but with the undead. Vampires being a prominent culture in today's, being a prominent element, motif in today's culture. And around that, I'll plug another event. A week after Natasha's talk, come back again, this time on a Wednesday a week, the 22nd, Rachel, am I correct? And it's not going to be here, it's going to be in Devlin Hall. We have an event on the movie Sinners. So if you want to see Irish undead meeting with black undead with very cool music, then come and hear a special panel, which will be a remarkable panel on the movie Sinners. So I'll recommend that. Ethnography, which is another thing which Ray does to perfection. can tell us a lot about funerary rites and about death. And here Ray is following in the footsteps of people like Susanna Smith's book, To Serve the Living, on funerary rites in African-American culture. Again, it raises the question, what do we have here between what is Irish and what is universal? And Ray is going to help us clarify that in his study that he's looking at now, which is both historical and present-based on death and dying in Ireland, and on death workers, as we're going to hear today, specifically about death care workers as they appear there. But I would like to end with one last thought to think about. So it looks like we're in for a morbid evening, by definition, even though the room is packed. But I'm not sure that it really is. Because there's one thing I can say, first of all, as an historian, more generally, as historians, we've figured out the cause of death. We've actually figured it out. People think about death, there's the famine, and there's catastrophes, and there's war now, and now we're on ceasefire, but we heard about a threat of destroying a whole civilization of mass death just the other day. We keep hearing about death and its fixation and kind of dealing with this topic, but we actually know the reason for death, and the reason for death is life. People die because they lived. It's inevitable. Death is the big certainty. We all know that death is coming. It's there. It's an inevitable part of life, and that's actually a great way of thinking about it, because death is the outcome of life. It's the fulfillment of life. And we can learn a lot, as Ray will show us, I hope, from how a society treats death. The practices, the rituals, the attitudes, the way we approach death tells us a lot about living and about life. And that, I'm hoping, is what we'll learn today in today's talk, which is really about a happy topic, as I see it, rather than a morbid one. Please, Ray, come on in.
Thank you very much for that entirely deserved and completely accurate introduction. I'm going to need all of you to lower your expectations. But no, it was a lovely eulogy. But switching registers to sincerity, I am sincerely grateful for the Burns Scholar Program. It's a fantastic opportunity. It's a great gig. Highly recommend, would do it again, 10 out of 10. It really has been fantastic. It's been, not just pleasant, it's been very productive. But there are a lot of people I need to thank. I need to thank especially everybody involved in the Burns Library, but especially Christian, who runs the place, and Caroline Pace for making this event possible. All of the librarians and archivists, you've been wonderful. I am particularly grateful to Guy, obviously, here in Irish Studies, but also to Rachel Young here and Maria Ordonez, and just everybody involved in Irish Studies who have made me and Lorraine feel so welcome here over the semester. So Aaron and Joe and Jim and Mary and Marjorie and Marcus and Mike and Oliver and Sheila and Rob, just to name a few, alphabetically, as it were. Look, I also want to thank my students, and several of whom are here. There's no extra credit in it for them. They know that. Maybe it was the free beer. I'm not kidding myself. But look, the students here have been fantastic. They've been very engaged. It's been refreshing to have sort of it's always nice to have a new crowd to hear your old jokes. Before I get into my case study, let me just offer some context about where all of this is coming from. As Guy mentioned, I'm working on a book. It is tentatively entitled The Dead Don't Bury Themselves, Irish Funerary Traditions in a Changing World. That title it's a quote from one of the people that I've interviewed for this. And what this project is doing in general is investigating changes and perhaps more importantly, continuities in Irish wakes and funerals over time, from from the 17th century to the present. But I take a particular interest in the perspectives of the contemporary specialists who make these rites of passage possible. So I'm talking about undertakers, also known as funeral directors, mostly in urban areas, also embalmers and clergy, of course, non-religious celebrants, but also coffin makers and monument carvers and crematorium operators and grave diggers. And of course, you may be asking yourself, my God, why that topic? And it is a fair question. I would say you may have heard the conventional wisdom that the Irish do death well. Some people think of it as a cliche even. I mean, and not that it's a competition, of course, but people in Ireland have a reputation for facing death squarely as a natural part of life, for assembling as many people as possible, and for spending time with each other, and not least with the remains of the deceased. So I think to myself, why not take the cliche seriously, see if it stands up to scrutiny? But more than that, while wakes and funerals may seem like a morbid topic to many of us here in the United States, I've been encouraged that people in Ireland, Catholic, Protestant, non-religious alike, have typically said, oh yeah, that is a good topic. That is where we're at our best. This also puts me in mind of Peter Sweeney. He's an introspective undertaker in Lewisburg, County Mayo. He rattled off to me the often quoted lines from Prime Minister William Gladstone that show me the manner in which a nation cares for its dead, and I will measure with mathematical exactness the tender mercies of its people and their loyalty to higher ideals. It's a good quote, right? Now, the fact that we have no solid evidence that he ever said or wrote this is entirely beside the point. He's onto something here. Peter's onto something here about the telling nature of rites of passage, not least this final and most inevitable one. So in general, following Peter's evocation of apocryphal Gladstone, I have found that there are ethnographic insights to be gained by addressing what is universal versus distinctive in Irish funerary traditions over time. My research suggests that often even the most recent innovations, such as funeral homes or embalming or live-streamed funerals, even these innovations can serve deeper cultural continuities and offer means to resist certain aspects of modernity. These are new ways of doing old things. But I'm not taking on all of that tonight, thankfully. What I'm doing instead is focusing on just one small corner of the larger whole, one aspect of what we might call occupational lore, shared among Irish death care workers. And specifically, I'm referring to expressions of a range of belief and disbelief in the existence of spirits of the dead and afterlife and other mysterious aspects of our supposedly disenchanted world. And the big picture here is that Irish death care workers bear witness neither to the wide persistence of beliefs in spirits of the dead, nor to the steady erosion of this belief in a largely secular age. Yes, undertakers, embalmers, celebrants regularly tell memorates, that's simply the name that folklorists use for personal narratives of arguably supernatural experiences. But their memorates, their storytelling reveals a patterned cultivation of ambiguity. And as we'll see, ambiguity is more complex and it's more productive than simple indecision. In a profession that mediates between the deceased and the bereaved, biological death and social continuity, mystery is rarely aggressively asserted or decisively dismissed. So memorates, hedged reflections, skeptical asides, together these operate as expressive resources for acknowledging and negotiating mystery. Okay, we're getting into it now. I want to point you to a classic study by a folklorist named Gillian Bennett. You see it here, A Last Poor Ghost. And in this, she explores how traditions of belief and disbelief are articulated by educated, middle-class, suburban women in the north of England, and particularly belief and disbelief regarding communication with the dead. So throughout her 87 interviews, Bennett identifies two competing worldviews. On the one hand, you've got a rationalist worldview that strives to demystify and perhaps explain away paranormal experiences. And then on the other hand, you have a supernaturalist worldview that entertains the possibility that there are more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in our philosophy. Interestingly, 2/3 of Bennett's interviewees expressed belief in the possibility of contact with the dead. And that's, a higher percentage than you might expect in a predominantly rationalist culture. Now, with that study in mind, or really even just your own experiences of discussing such matters with friends and family, it may be little surprise that my interviews with Irish death care workers revealed the same two opposing camps or discursive traditions. One qualification, though, my interviews suggest that belief and non-belief are the far extremes on a spectrum that's dominated by a vast gray middle zone of hedging and equivocation. An additional qualification. I found that for those professing the strongest belief, perhaps supernatural is not the most appropriate term. That is to say, maybe a better term would be numinous or transcendent or paranormal or extra-normal. But for believers, the so-called supernatural is not above or beyond the natural, but simply another facet, however mysterious, of reality. So, in fact, we will see in their memorates, again and again, non-human animals. I'm talking about robins and butterflies and mice and swans and dogs and goats and horses. Animals frequently are marshaled to bear witness to numinous or transcendent realities. So the natural world can be seen as quite expansive and interconnected enough to embrace everything often referred to as supernatural. We'll come back to the animals. We'll get there. But if we review just the spectrum of belief and disbelief in my interviews, I think I can identify the most common categories as follows. Relatively straightforward memorates supporting statements of firm belief. 2, kind of hedged memorates that tack back and forth between rationalist and supernaturalist explanations, offering a sense of equivocal belief. So again, complex ambiguity, not simple indecision. 3, humorous memorates told mostly for comic effect, thereby undermining, without necessarily denying, a supernaturalist interpretation. 4, skeptical statements, sometimes illustrated with narrative, rationalizing or explaining away specific beliefs in either psychological terms or scientific terms. And then finally, called neutral or non-committal observations of other people's beliefs. So, for example, beliefs that returning spirits can take the form of butterflies or robins, that windows and doors must be cracked open in a wake house so as not to impede a spirit on its journey, or feathers being taken as a sign that the deceased has taken flight. Now, hang on a sec. By the way, all of these beliefs and many more have a history, of course, and all are documented in the archives of the National Folklore Collection, the successor to the Irish Folklore Commission, housed at University College Dublin, also accessible online at dúchas.ie. Now, altogether, of the belief-related statements and stories I've collected, the greatest number, a little over 80%, would be the second and third category. So either searching contemplations that yield a hedged position or humorous anecdotes that remain curious but maybe non-committal on belief. These equivocal formulations far outnumber expressions of either firm belief or firm disbelief in spirits of the dead lingering after biological death. So now, I want to begin a survey near the firm belief end of the spectrum, but not with one of my field tapes, actually. Instead, this is a remarkable public moment on Season 5, Episode 15 of The Tommy Tiernan Show on RTE1. Look, if you don't know the show, it's a remarkable bit of improvisation because the host, the comedian Tommy Tiernan, doesn't know ahead of time who his guests are. It's a good shtick. So on this particular episode, he figures out soon enough that his guest is this fella, David McGowan, who is the subject of an award-winning documentary. He's also the author of this book, A Life Among the Dead, Stories from an Irish Funeral Director. And he also owns funeral homes in Mayo and Sligo. He is a frequent media commentator. Indeed, he's something like a national celebrity funeral director, which I suppose happens only in Ireland. Now, along with him, as you'll see, is his daughter, Bereaved McGowan. She also directs funerals and embalms. She's also a musician who records under the name Brigine. There she is in all her finery. I have several hours of interviews with the two of them, also with another sister named Etna or Etty. She also embalms. But to be fair, Tommy Tiernan Show, better production values. And you can also go see the entire interview on YouTube or on RTE Player if you like. But I'm going to drop us into the middle of the conversation, which includes both belief statements and supporting illustrations. So let's have a look. Okay, so there's a lot going on there. As you'll note, Tommy Tiernan's first question is really about corpses, not about spirits or the afterlife. He says, what is it like to work in the company of dead people? Now, that's something that many people would find distasteful or daunting or scary. Breach, however, is quick to redirect to underscore the privilege of caring for those who can no longer care for themselves, to respect their dignity, to get them presentable so that the bereaved can say a final farewell in person, which has long been a shared priority for people in Ireland. Now, it's David who brings up communication between this world and a spiritual world. And his claims are squarely, that's not it, that's it. His claims are squarely in line with traditional belief in Ireland that the spirit of the deceased lingers close by for a time, at least as long as the typically 3-day period between death, wake, funeral, and burial, before moving on. He leaves the destination open to interpretation, but of course, in Catholic terms, the destination would be heaven, hell, or for most, purgatory. Furthermore, David's suggestion that the dead can be called upon by the living for help is also in line with long-held vernacular belief and practice. Now, where he doubles down is illustrating aspects of this belief statement with the memorate about the picture crashing down off the wall. Now, of course, the interview does pivot back and forth between David and Breach, and a contrast between them reiterates another pattern that Bennett also noted, and that is, when talking about encounters with the dead, people tend to choose between two narrative strategies or performative modes. One is linear, chronologically plotted, seemingly rehearsed or polished in style. The other is nonlinear, often circular. It may involve what Bennett calls riffling and pooling, and what she means by that is a way of slowing down the narrative at points, oscillating between possible explanations without resolving them, even eliciting audience reaction and dialogue. Now, note that on the one hand, David's story is the first type. It's orderly, it's chronological, and as with most personal experience narratives, it begins with orienting scene setting in present tense. So he says, usually I go in to set up the coffin. Then it shifts to past tense, proceeding through a succession of complicating events. And then it builds narrative velocity to an almost punchline-like crescendo. I was just about to say to her, I'll move it, and the next thing we heard this almighty bang, the picture fell off the wall. Following a pause for effect, David brings us back to the general topic at hand, the prospect of spirits for the sake of evaluation. He strongly implies that the dead lingering, communicating, even exercising agency are all possible if you add up the evidence presented. In life, the dead man hated that picture. It's never moved in 30 years. What else could cause it to fall at this very moment? He doesn't tell you what to think, but his rhetorical intent seems clear. And as he says, doesn't take a PhD to figure it out. Now, had Tiernan not asked a subject-shifting question, David might have offered a summarizing present tense coda such as, that sort of thing happens too often for me not to believe that the spirits of the dead are still with us. He said things just like that to me in longer form interviews and in other media appearances. That's typically how memorates fade back into conversation through generalization. But more than that, when given enough space in longer form interviews, David typically follows up with a pair of additional linear, polished stories. In the first one, David's hearse breaks down temporarily on a bridge over a river while transporting a coffined body. Later, he learns that this was the dead man's favorite fishing spot. In the second, David is preparing a body in his mortuary, but the woman's face seems to refuse cosmetics, which seem to just slide off. Later, the daughter of the deceased says that this makes sense because in life her mother always hated makeup. Now, if we shift to Breach, on the other hand, her efforts, at least in the Tommy Tiernan clip, are more searching, something other than linear narrative with an orderly beginning, middle, and end. Doesn't mean she's bad at storytelling. It's a different presentational style with different affordances and different effects. In this instance, she wants to avoid offering a memorat with too many identifying details, but also, as she says, it's hard to explain, much less narrativise feeling, a spiritual presence, no matter how strong. And the way she should suggest this is looser. It's less invested in representing temporally organized events. It's more invested in exploring possible meanings while leaving things open to discussion. All the while, she is keenly aware that from a rationalist perspective, she could easily be dismissed. You think I'm daft, don't you, she asks Tommy. So this searching quality of presentation, it isn't inherently non-committal. It can point in a certain direction, but it includes more, like Bennett calls it, face-saving ambiguity. It invites discussion. It leaves final interpretation open to debate, whereas the other polished linear strategy leaves little room for discussion or debate and perhaps forecloses on them. Bear in mind, however, Breach is perfectly capable of offering narratives in the more polished linear mode in interviews with me. And that may reiterate the just sociolinguistic truism that how a story is told has everything to do with who's speaking to whom, when, where, and to what ends. And unlike when Breach is speaking on RTE, addressing an unseen imagined audience that represents the full spectrum of belief and disbelief, in conversations with me, she's been able to see that I'm open to hearing what she has to say without passing judgment or thinking her daft. So she has less motivation to employ face-saving ambiguity. But as I say, I found that, like her father, she has a few polished set-piece memorats of her own. Here's an example. She tells a story about being in charge of repatriating a body from the UK, and she got this panicked call from the hearse driver who had been contracted for the transportation because he was stuck in gridlocked traffic, and he was unlikely to make it to the ferry in time, which would force Breach to have to postpone the funeral, and that would mess up everybody's booked travel plans, far-flung extended family and friends. But as it happens, she got a call back in the nick of time. The driver says, it's okay, we're gonna make it to the funeral, the traffic has started moving again, and he describes to her the cause of the delay as he's passing it, which was apparently a large number of goats broke out onto the motorway, and they had to be herded back into a field. Well, Breach contacts the family and tells them it's okay, we can have it as planned, tells them what happened, and they just fall out laughing, a huge outsized response. And when they finally recover, one of the nieces says to her, like, you're not gonna believe this, but one of the things my aunt hated most about moving to London was that she couldn't keep goats anymore. I mean, she would get on the train to go to farms that have goats and stuff like that. So basically, for Breach and for the dead woman's kin, the timing of the great goat escape on the N24 was almost too absurd a coincidence not to be interpreted as spiritual intervention. Another polished memorat that Breach tells, along with her sister Etty, concerns their shared experience of playing music in the embalming room. One time when preparing a body together, a song by the popular singer Adele came on the radio, and then the song started to crackle and just turned to static. Now, they were both engaged. They couldn't immediately adjust the radio, but oddly, as soon as the Adele song was wrapping up, the static ceases, the radio plays normally again without needing to be retuned. They later find out that in life, the deceased woman they were working on could not stand listening to Adele. In a coda, Etty adds that she habitually leaves the radio on when bodies overnight in the embalming room so that any lingering spirit would feel less alone, more attended to. And yet more than once she has discovered that the station has changed or been changed by the time she returns in the morning. Now, as told, these are events that one could interpret as coincidence or as spiritual intervention. Breach, for one, is not actually interested in persuading anyone of anything, she says. She says, quote, it's not about preaching, and I don't want to be this person that's going around telling everyone about spirits because I don't want to have an impact on someone else's beliefs. They've not experienced what I have, might not ever, end quote. At the same time, she's very clear about what she believes based on what she's observed. And she prefaces another pair of memorats with, you might not believe this, but I don't care because I saw it with my own eyes. Now, these two memorats concern instances of her witnessing a spirit leaving a body that manifests visually as what she calls glitching, It's told in the riffling and pooling style. It's a little long to parse here. Read the book. But interestingly, Bennett found that women she interviewed who were most open to belief in the spiritual presence of the dead largely preferred this nonlinear, searching style of narration. Whereas those less open to this belief tended toward a linear, polished style, leading Bennett to make a distinction between stories told for true versus stories told for fun. Now, I would not preclude belief motivating stories told in either style by the McGowans, but it's not lost on me that the more polished linear style can attract greater audience skepticism. In other words, a suspicion of embellishment or fabrication. So I'm not going to name the person I'm about to quote here, but he's another undertaker and embalmer. But note his reaction to David McGowan's more frequently told memorates. Talking about the makeup wouldn't go on because the woman never wore makeup, or the hearse can't go to a particular point in the road because the guy did his fishing there. I don't think that does our business any favors, or our service to the client any favors. This adding in a spooky element to it or something, I think that makes people uneasy about being in the presence of the dead, which is a normal part of life. There's nothing frightening or spooky about it. Nothing's going to happen at all. So I don't like all this drawing in the paranormal in On Top of Funerals and telling these stories of the paranormal, as I don't believe them in the first place. Either I'm totally insensitive to the dead, and I've been dealing with them for 3 decades, but I've never, ever seen anything that didn't have a natural explanation. Now, I'm going to interrupt this to say, or to anticipate, that even after this almost classic reformulation of the rationalist position, this person goes on to leave room for both mystery and an underlying plan of interconnection and sacred power, if only vaguely grasped. So he continues, that said, I also firmly believe that there is a power behind all of us. I feel it myself. And I often reflect on that mystical moment when you are alive and now 1 moment later you're dead. It's quite a mystical moment. Where does your energy go? Is your energy just gone? Look, I definitely feel that there is a power. Now, God, whatever you call God, there's a power there. I feel the earth is unique as far as we know, and there is a power behind all of this. And I definitely know that moment, it feeds into that energy when it disappears, into that unknown. So this individual, he hasn't got it all worked out either, but he suspects an element of what he calls showmanship in twice-told tales. And yet, despite 3 decades without experiencing anything like what the McGowans described, this undertaker remains open to mystery and to entertaining the prospects of both sacred power and a divine plan. In fact, in no point at 76 interviews with 69 death care workers so far, has anyone made a point of saying to me that they categorically cannot believe in the possibility of a spirit or soul enduring after death. The closest I can come to that are proclamations of self-professed atheists, agnostics, and those in the growing ranks of the spiritual but not religious, who are critical of perceived inconsistencies or implausibilities in official church teachings. And when it comes to the afterlife and the possibility of interacting with spirits of the dead, humanist celebrant Billy McGlynn of Dingle, County Kerry, is certain of only one thing: that such beliefs wax and wane within the same person over time, depending on context, and they may never resolve. Or, as Galway City Funeral Director Katrina O'Flaherty freely admits about the contextual nature of belief more generally, quote, I'm not a very religious person, but I will be when I'm in trouble. I'll be ringing the man above big time when I'm knocking on his door. I'm very human, I'm very normal, I'm very a la carte. When I'm in trouble, I'm very much into it. When I'm not, well, I don't mean that disrespectfully, but it's just being honest about myself. So with all of this in mind, recapping, with waxing and waning of belief, competition between rationalist and supernaturalist interpretation, shifting rhetorical stances depending on audience, differing performance styles for stories told for fun versus stories told for true. Given all of these productive tensions, it may be no surprise that the vast majority of stories told by Irish death care workers regarding the spiritual presence of the dead are equivocal, while still leaving open the possibility of belief. Perhaps the simplest narrative strategy to evoke the ambivalent middle ground is to present a mystery and then just leave it up to the audience to decide. To give you an example, here's Charlie Lynch. He's the undertaker in Castledurg, County Tyrone. He shares a memorate told by the daughter of a woman whose funeral he directed. As requested, Charlie played a favorite song of the deceased at her removal from the wake house to the church, and then another favorite song at the graveside before burial. After the daughter and the rest of the family returned home from the post-funeral tea, they were amazed and not a little frightened to hear the first favorite song and then the second one playing in the dead woman's room. Eventually, they found that the source of the music was the dead woman's phone in her purse, a phone that requires facial recognition, specifically the dead woman's face, in order to open it. Charlie concludes his version of the story simply, "So that's one incident I couldn't explain to you. Make of that what you will." If Charlie is non-committal about interpretation, Galway City Funeral Director Rob Keneally may suggest a more skeptical orientation. Rob's memorates tend to emphasize humor, which potentially undermines supernaturalist interpretation, but still without explicitly ruling it out. For example, he recalls having to help rescue a swan that had become trapped on the roof of his funeral home. And this involved carrying away a very angry bird wrapped in a tarp while trying to avoid its aggressive pecks and hissing bites. Later, before a funeral that afternoon, Rob was making small talk with the daughter of the deceased, and here I quote him. "So I say, well, we had a bit of excitement here today. There was a swan landed on the roof, and there was no easy way to get him down." And the daughter says, "Really? That's awful funny. Mammy was always writing poetry about swans and drawing swans, and she had this thing about swans her whole life." And I says, "I know where you're going with this. You think it might be Mammy's spirit or whatever in the swan." And she says, "Oh, I don't know." And I say, "Well, I don't think it was your mother." And she asked me why. And I said, "Because it was a nasty swan." And she says, "Oh, yeah, that's Mammy, all right." Now, Rob gets to present himself as a rationalist skeptic. The daughter gets to vent relatably while landing a psychologically realistic punchline. I mean, is it a memorat if the prospect of spirits isn't taken very seriously? The effort here seems to be about flirting with perennially interesting questions while remaining non-committal, keeping it light, entertaining. In another memorat, Rob recalls that a well-behaved little dog attended the funeral of an elderly gentleman and alternated between lying under the coffin and attending to the widow sitting nearby, occasionally licking her fingers. Speaking to the son of the deceased later, Rob remarked, "Oh, that's a grand little doggy you have," to which the son replies, "Well, it's not our dog. We thought it was yours, but it was getting along so grand with Ma'am, we didn't say anything." So Rob concludes the story by recapping, "No one knew what about the dog, but it was strange. He sat with the lady all through for the hour and a half, sat there, the best little behaved dog you ever saw, then just disappeared." Now, Rob didn't offer any evaluation or coda as I had expected, which prompted me to say, that is strange. Any thoughts? To which he replied, "None that I'm going to admit to." To which I replied, "Seriously, you're going to leave me hanging?" To which he relented and said, "Look, okay, do I believe it was the spirit of the husband licking the wife's hand before the final journey? Possibly. Would it be hard to prove? Definitely. But it was lovely. I thought it was their dog, they thought it was mine, but you don't always get to know who the dogs are." I love that line. I mean, it is so distilled, it is so context dependent, but it says so much about the nature of mystery. It conveys not confusion, but something like composure in the face of what we cannot expect to fully comprehend. Furthermore, now that examples have accumulated, this frequent evocation of animals in negotiations over supernaturalist versus rationalist interpretation deserves a closer look. Nature in general, the animal kingdom in particular, seem to serve as a removed but relevant realm for entertaining the notion of an all-encompassing plan, for bearing witness to interconnectedness between humans and non-human animals, between this world and a spiritual world. Whether non-human animals are harbingers, messengers, or agents of the dead, or even manifestations of the dead themselves, they are marshaled repeatedly in narrative for a potential glimpse into the really real. Their representation often makes a bid amidst continual negotiation between belief, disbelief, and that broad gray zone in between. So on the one hand, undertakers in Kilkee, County Clare, John Howard and Martha Lillis Howard, bear witness to dogs and horses spontaneously responding to the death of their owners in ways that suggest they're well aware of death as a transition. They're capable of mourning, and perhaps they are more connected and sensitive to spirits and spiritual matters. Likewise, Breda McCarthy, funeral director in Ballyvorney, County Cork, she is certain that the butterfly winging its way through the family funeral home in midwinter was not just a sign from her recently deceased husband, it was him, his spirit. On the other hand, County Wexford's civil celebrant Joanne McAteer recalls a moment when people became excited at the sight of a butterfly at one of her funerals, exclaiming, "It's her! Oh my God, she's here!" Meanwhile, Joanne was thinking to herself, "It's a friggin' moth, people, but okay, let's go with this, whatever gives them comfort." Likewise, there seems to be a general consensus among undertakers and gravediggers that robins are curious creatures and they habitually will scour freshly turned earth for worms and a new grave. So mourners regarding them as a spiritual presence is likely a matter of wishful thinking. Or, as Joanne recalls from one of particular burial, there was a robin that just kept coming in, hopping around the grave. And they all got great comfort from that. And I met a friend, one of the mourners later, and she said, "Do you know that robin keeps coming into my garden?" And I'm like, "Oh, that's wonderful." But of course, the robin was probably always there, but now he means something. I have loads of robins in my garden. I don't think they mean anything in particular, but they're lovely to see. But they're very reassuring for people, and they usually are seen as somebody who's passed away. So nature has a funny way of giving comfort to people. I do think that's very powerful. So while Joanne discounts a spiritual presence in these incidents, she focuses instead on human needfulness and projection during grief. She ends by giving nature its due as a powerfully resonant milieu for finding comfort in a sense of interconnection. Likewise, her brother, Colin McAteer, is an undertaker and coffin producer in County Donegal. He featured in the talk last year. He's a step more explicit about nature while recounting a moment that made both him and Joanne think twice about a connection between spirits, animals, and nature. They were at Woodbrook, that is the natural or green burial ground that Colin established in County Wexford, and Joanne was serving as a celebrant for a funeral and burial that was being live streamed from the graveside. And as they both tell it, a mouse early on took up position in front of the camera, and it proceeded to hop about, kind of alternating between minding the people assembled and seeming to kind of mug for the camera. And as Colin recalls, Joanne spoke for 40 minutes, longer than a normal service, a lot of music as well, and the mouse stayed and everybody was just enthralled. So Joanne could have said anything. I don't think it mattered because everybody was looking at the mouse and the mouse at them. And the mouse stayed there until the last shovel full of clay had gone on top of the grave, and then he kind of stood up on his wee back feet, looked at the camera, jumped back into the hedge, never to be seen again. So there is something with the way nature interacts with people during grief. I think that we don't understand it, or I certainly wouldn't try and claim to understand, but there's certainly something in it. There's too many coincidences otherwise. So Colin is willing to entertain something more than coincidence without being able to completely explain the relationship between the natural and spiritual world, or the ontological and teleological status of animals. As Claude Lévi-Strauss famously observed, animals are good to think, perhaps especially when it comes to such ontological and teleological matters. I'll let that land for a second. In the face of death and its destabilization of categories, animals may resonate because they occupy a liminal zone between the domesticated and the wild, the intentional and the instinctual, the symbolic and the real. They're good to think because their presence can be read as coincidence or communication, projection or presence. Furthermore, animals may be not only good to think, but also good to relate to, perhaps even good to grieve with. In burial grounds and funeral homes, animals appear not merely as symbols, but as participants, arriving, lingering, interacting, withdrawing. The dog who sits with the widow, the mouse who remains until the last shovel of clay, the robin who returns daily to a mourner's garden. These things become entangled in grief events in ways that may exceed simple coincidence, yet resist definitive interpretation. Rather than asking whether we project meaning onto animals, it may be more productive to recognize that death undermines human exceptionalism. It heightens our awareness of shared vulnerability across species. In such moments, animals are neither proof of spiritual intervention nor reducible to random fauna. Rather, they may serve as co-present actors within an expanded field of meaning-making. So altogether, animals bolster a worldview in which interconnectedness remains imaginable even within a broadly secular frame. They allow for a kind of enchantment without requiring a profession of faith. Bear in mind, however, Joanne, for her part, is not actually mounting a case for firm, universal disbelief when she discounts butterflies and robins as a spiritual presence. Arguably, she is playing the long game in terms of rhetoric in a way that supports her ultimate position of qualified belief. That is, from a rationalist perspective, she may come off as a more reliable narrator for having expressed many doubts before she concludes, look, I've now accepted that when we die, we're not there anymore. We're gone. We have left our bodies and moved on, but I definitely believe there's something to the spirit. I don't know where it goes, but the body is just a vessel. This is just to get us through. What moves on and what matters, though, is the spirit. So for all the plausible deniability and face-saving ambiguity and oftentimes humor that characterizes the broad, equivocal middle ground, the spiritual presence of the dead repeatedly reemerges as more than a possibility, if less than a certainty. And here I am starting to wrap up, I swear. But what emerges from the perspectives of Irish death care workers is neither the clear persistence of supernatural belief, nor the decisive victory of secular rationalism, but rather a patterned tolerance for and extended cultivation of ambiguity. In spaces where the dead are restored and dressed, communed with and commemorated, buried or cremated, questions around spiritual presence and agency are neither fully resolved nor categorically dismissed. Instead, they circulate, sometimes as polished narratives, sometimes as hesitant reflections, sometimes as jokey anecdotes, sometimes as provocations. Perhaps the dead manifest through robins, dogs, goats, or swans, malfunctioning radios, or pictures crashing to the floor. Or maybe these are just coincidences, projections, narrative patterning imposed upon randomness after the fact. The point is not for one explanation to prevail. The point is to keep the question alive. So belief and disbelief here are not stable identities. They are situational stances responsive to context and to audience. Likewise, rationalist and supernaturalist interpretations do not function as mutually exclusive camps so much as alternative resources for working through overlapping repertoires. Neither indecision nor incoherence, equivocation is a socially adaptive stance and a practical necessity. More broadly, the occupational lore of Irish death care workers complicates any characterization of the contemporary era as defined by disenchantment, as someone like Max Weber would have it. In these stories, enchantment remains negotiable, situational, and rhetorically managed. And even in a bureaucratized, technologically mediated death care system shaped by all the hallmarks of modernity, mystery persists, not as professed doctrine, but as lived possibility, and ambiguity serves as its most affective and effective expressive resource. So, Sinead Goramila Makiv, thank you all very much for coming.
I have perhaps an unfair and completely biased question.
Great place to start.
Yeah. Where are the cats? No, I genuinely though, like we think of cats so often as a supernaturally attuned creatures. At least perhaps this is more an Anglo tradition than an Irish tradition, but black cats specifically. Yeah. Where are the cats?
That's a great question. Now, They're all over the archives. Not to worry, in the 30s at least. Associations with death, I don't know, I'd have to go look into that. They just didn't show up in my interviews. So that's a great question. I don't have an answer to it, but I will say this, because, you know, why waste an opportunity to keep talking? One of the whole animal thing was a big surprise to me. One of the benefits of trying to pursue an inductive as possible method is that you don't show up with an already formed idea and then go find those bits of reality that fit it. I mean, you may not think you're doing that, but it's a liability. Anyway, I did not expect these animals to show up. And so it forced me to read a whole bunch of stuff I never had before, which was great. It's one of the great things about this gig is that you learn things despite yourself. So yeah, Rowan, that's a great question. Poor Ponger Bond didn't show up in these interviews, but you know, I do need to get back to these people for at least one more round, and I'm gonna bring up those cats.
Well done. Next, over here.
Back to Joe.
Okay, well, Daisy changed. Oh, I can walk up. Sure.
It's not just that I prefer dogs.
Thank you so much, Christian. And thank you so much, Ray.
Thank you, John.
This was wonderful. And I love the very careful attention you paid to overlapping repertoires. Rather than setting up a false dichotomy, this attention you've paid to equivocation feels really fruitful here. And I'm interested in that in relation to the animals, because it feels like there's a way in which there can be the supernaturalist or paranormalist take of the animals are part of a transcendental nature that can contain a more spiritual existence than just like raw matter. But then you also brought up this idea of like death undermining human exceptionalism, which also feels on the table here and feels a little more rationalist in ways, but the two could helpfully overlap. I was wondering, in some of the quotes from like Joanne and Colin, it felt very much aligned with like nature and its transcendentalism, but did you encounter in any of these memorates or any of these interviews speakers who spoke to death undermining human exceptionalism?
Yeah, okay, so that was an observation that just sort of came out of the materials and I didn't have the wherewithal at the time to ask anyone that. And that's one of the reasons you go back and, you know, you put under someone's nose like, hey, what do you think of this? That's a great question, but it's also a kind of a fourth date question that you get to ask when you go back. You know?
And it feels like a great observation on your part, so thank you.
Sky?
People keeping me running. I'm going to go to Natasha just because it's easier.
Oh, yeah. I know.
I have a cat anecdote.
Oh, good.
I have come across a story in which this would have been back in probably the 30s, 40s, right? When the body was being waked at home and a young couple was left to watch the body overnight. This would have been a fairly safe form of courtship in a way.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you don't want to do anything in front of a dead body, probably.
Right.
So this young couple is, you know, hanging out watching this corpse, and all of a sudden they see movement. And they shriek, and they run, and they look back, and what was it? But it was a cat. There was a cat under the sheet. Scared them. But so that's my anecdote.
I'm sorry, where did you hear or read that? I'm curious.
Pardon? I'm gonna have to look it up.
Okay.
But it's a story that comes up in some of the stuff that I teach, so I can find it.
Okay.
But my question is, because you're interviewing funeral home workers, and of course, you know, most of the funerals are all of the funerals are now taking place in funeral homes, and bodies are being prepared in funeral homes and such, and yet, you know, there are still wakes in houses, at least in some of these, right? Mm-hmm. Have you encountered at all any wake games, any accounts of wake games, any accounts of keening at all, anything like that?
Yeah, great question. So Natasha is bringing up a number of the customs and practices that were most associated with, you know, the merry wake of the 19th century and so forth. And I would say there are definitely vestiges of those things. So, for example, but at some wakes more than others. Let me remind me if I forget, if I drop the thread, John McHugh. We're going to come back to John McHugh. But just one thing about funeral homes. It's an idea that was imported from the United States. The first one was in Cork City. The O'Connor brothers built one in their old carriage house when they no longer needed it because they had motorized hearses. And my first thought was like, oh, that's a shame. That's like American hegemony and all that neat stuff. But in fact, I mean, the people who make use of them, many, in a lot of areas, still have the home wake as well. And in a way, there's a kind of a complementarity there in that it allows for the most number of people to come in, say their respects, and then the wake can be a little bit more intimate. A lot of people feel like they got to go to both. But also, for people who don't have the kind of house that can host a wake, let's say, you're living in an apartment in the city. So it has become a new space to do a lot of the things that people used to do at wakes, but especially storytelling and remembering the dead and the types of people brought to mind by the dead. Now, wake games like Sean O'Sullivan would have talked about in Irish wake amusements, some of which we've talked about in class are quite bawdy. I haven't seen that, but I have seen at certain types of wakes, especially if we're talking about the wake of an older bachelor who doesn't have a lot of family around, no one to be too concerned about the carpet getting messed up. Shenanigans happen. Like a neighbor in Ahiarn, when he was probably 15 or 16, went to John McHugh's wake. John McHugh was the owner of the house that I rented and was known as sort of a Falstaff-like character. And so this fella, Declan, just went to maybe looking for some safe courtship, but definitely cigarettes and beer. And he had too much, and he fell asleep in the wake room and then woke up with no eyebrows. So these things do still happen. Now, the keening is very interesting to me. And there's definitely a lot in this book about, sorry, let me answer the keening question and then on the other tangent. No, I haven't heard keening, but I keep running into people, especially in Donegal, saying like, yeah, but Granny did it. And it lasted longer than we think. I will say that one part of the book that I've enjoyed writing and learning about was that women were for the longest time so central to wakes in particular, and not just the hospitality, but like setting up, washing the body, getting it prepared, and being basically, and as keeners, acting as basically like midwives for death. And this was the case for the longest time. What's changed? We have accounts of after the sort of we have accounts of like priests literally whipping keening women to get them to stop. So there was a long process in the 19th century of basically disciplining the wake and these wake games, and women were definitely displaced by the professionalization of, like, there wasn't always such a thing as an undertaker. That's a 19th century phenomenon for Ireland, and by the clergy not wanting to cede any of the ritual centrality. That being said, read the book. It's interesting how this stuff gets shunted to the side and not credited, but is still there and has come back in new form with the rise of female undertakers and embalmers, who are the majority of people going to school for this sort of stuff now. Sorry, that went on too long, but I'm really interested in the women chapter, which I haven't quite finished because it's just not quite right yet, but it's a really interesting story.
Back here.
Thank you so much for this. I was wondering if you could speak to your definition of like a death care worker, because I know that you're speaking to funeral directors, and obviously that makes sense, but then you're also speaking to ministers, and that feels like one element of the job, a very important element, but of a multifaceted job. So I was wondering if you could speak to your process of who you decided to talk to and where you were looking to for these stories.
Yeah. Okay, so death care worker is not a word. That's just, I needed an umbrella term to not have to keep saying undertakers and embalmers and clergy and celebrants and grave diggers and monument carvers and coffin makers and crematorium. You see the problem. But I wouldn't say that that's people say, well, I am a death care worker. That's not how. But, so you're absolutely right to point out that there's different specialists, and I would say there's different specialists for different phases. I mean, if we go back to good old Arnold van Gennep, all rites of passage have basically 3 phases, and there's you sort of remove yourself from society, and then there's this liminal period, and then there's a reintegration. And it's helped me organize the book because in the first phases, I'm talking to people who are facilitating. So the undertakers and embalmers. And then I get to move on to the next phase with the celebrants and the clergy. And then I get to move on to the next phase of different specialists who deal with, committal or disposal. But the real answer is that's just an umbrella term, but there are it takes a village, right? And I'm also don't want to ignore that the ethos of the Mehel, that is the volunteer work party, is still very much alive. And there is a lot of labor, invisible labor, especially by women running wakes and so forth, that is, people aren't seeking credit. It's not a professional thing, but the professionals are there. But they see themselves as facilitating the Mehel ethos. So what happens during the pandemic when you can't go and shake and hug and things like that? That really threw people for a loop. And it's amazing how vernacular culture will just be suppressed and then somehow come out over here. So they do the best they can. They line the roads, they wave at the hearse, and just wait for us to be able to go back to the usual script. I think I might have lost the thread in there somewhere, but I hope I answered some of your question.
Hi, Ray. Thank you so much. I'm going to take maybe Rowan's stance that this probably isn't a fair question. Sorry. I wanted to ask, while you're interviewing death care workers, how much, or do they have a sense of how much the people that they're dealing with are expecting this sign? Right? How much do they think that someone, and it's hard, right, to separate, these are people grieving, so it's hard to separate the grief of the loss of a loved one versus the grief of not seeing that loved one in butterfly form, right, at a wake. But how much when they come into it do they expect people to search for a sign? And therefore, do you just stay really quiet when it's a moth and not a butterfly? Or do you say, oh, look, a robin, isn't that one? How much are they invested in knowing that people expect this versus it's so interesting that this story happened all on its own?
Yeah, that's a good question. So if I'm talking about undertakers or funeral directors, as they prefer to be called usually in cities, part of their occupational lore, that they shared with me, but also talked to each other about, is they try very hard to be in the background and just facilitate what people want. So they've seen it all. They've seen people, families that are just in bits, some that believe, some that don't believe. So they have to be ready to you have to have a certain natural ability to read a room, to anticipate people's needs. And so if we're all about that butterfly's mammy, we're going with it. And I've never sensed any kind of derision of looking down their nose at people because there's just such a wide range. So, there's a lot of pastoral care involved. And it goes beyond the burial as well with some of them. And it is maybe not a coincidence that, I want to say, get this right, 4 of the undertakers I've interviewed started out in seminary. They started out to be priests, for whatever reason left it, but they still have the need to exercise that pastoral muscle, and this is their way to do it. Again, I may have gone off your question, but it's not an expectation, but it's not a surprise when it happens. And they'll play along. I think there's someone right behind you. Oh.
Really just do one more here. I'm going to go to Tom, all right? Because Mary, you're on campus. The nice thing is that you're here for a few more weeks. So we'll see you at other events and we can conversation there. So, Tom, you get the...
Yeah, hi. I just have one question about the decision you made about methodology.
Yeah.
In that they were wonderful interviews. You obviously are very skilled at this, knew when the person could say or should say more and pulled it out of them. But the question I have is, how did you decide to make just one person anonymous, at least the ones you reported on, versus all of the other folks having to identify themselves? And I wonder if you would have gotten different results if it had been totally anonymous. Would people have been a bit more direct and, less, we do anything, we handle everything, Would there have been a difference between the two interview techniques, anonymity versus you're identified, we're talking to Mr. Ford, and if Mr. Ford comes out and says something about, I'm damn well looking for butterflies, maybe the skeptics are not going to say, I'm going to the next town over or something.
Yeah.
Do you understand? Is that okay?
Yeah, I think so. That's a great question. So there is a long tradition in Irish folklore scholarship of doing something like what you suggest, which is, for the longest time they were underfunded, and so what they would do is they would send out surveys and hope for the best, and they'd get a lot of stuff would come back. And there is a lot to be said for that methodology in terms of getting information and being able to plot it on a map, for example. Like you can sort of see how certain customs or language attributes or things like that can line up, and you can start to see regional cultural patterns. However, another one of the benefits might be that you get a really good informant, and then that causes Kevin Danaher, Shauna Sullivan, or someone to go talk to that person at greater length. I mean, I think that you both have different affordances and effects. I feel like what I did was I interviewed enough people to where I'm getting some of the same answers again and again, and that sort of felt like you never feel like it's complete. But then there were certain folks who were just more willing to talk, also more articulate, that you go back to them again and again. So what you try to do is a balance of a kind of, I wouldn't call it quantitative, but like a quantitative and qualitative in the sense of not everybody I've interviewed is going to show up in the book except in the thank you very much for helping me. Some of them are just really good exemplars of something I need to talk about, such as, women coming back in the business, or the difficulties of getting other people, the next generation, to want to take up this work. The pastoral care involved. So certain spokespeople are best at certain things, but I couldn't have just interviewed 6 people and known what the patterns are. I had to have a lot of people for the patterns. And this is different from what I normally do. This involved a lot of traveling around, a lot of scary cold calling. And it was a little more journalistic than I'm used to doing, because I'm used to sitting in one place and getting to know everybody for a year at least. This was a challenge, and I enjoyed it, and it got me into almost every county in Ireland. But after a while, I was like, okay, this chapter is definitely about Charlie Lynch, and that chapter is definitely about Breach McGowan, and so forth.
All right. Well, again, thank you to Ray.
Thank you all for coming. I really do appreciate it.